Alright, before getting into anything, I can already tell what some of you are probably thinking right now. Osros, isn't Yandere Simulator dead at this point? I mean, Alex was outed as a predator, and several people have left his project, including asset creators, voice actors, etc. So why are you still talking about it? And to you, my good commenter, I say that when things die, what do you do with them? You dissect them and see how they work, of course. So, in my previous videos about Yandere Simulator, I more or less glossed over the game itself, as obviously the main point of those videos was to talk about the drama that Alex himself had gotten himself into. In this video, I hope to rectify that and talk about the game itself, some of the game's problems, the problems in the game's coding, and some misconceptions that people have had about the game's coding. Now, before getting into things, I just want to say that I am by no means an expert when it comes to programming. Although I'm still on track to completing my degree in computer science, and at this point I've also completed multiple different coding classes such as C++, C#, JavaScript, and Python. So I think it's fair to say that I know a little bit when it comes to programming. That's why I invite anybody who is an expert or has a lot of experience to leave your thoughts in the comments about what you would change about the code or even critiques about my suggestions. This video, in essence, is meant to be a learning experience on what not to do when developing a video game. Also, one last disclaimer before we get into everything, I won't be covering the code in its entirety as I don't think I'm anywhere near qualified to be talking about the whole thing. Instead, I'll be talking about sections that I found that I feel like I could reasonably change. But with that out of the way, let's get into it. Part 1. The Student Script. So first, let's go over the main culprit here, the student behavior script file. Most people when critiquing Yandere Simulator's code point to this file as the main problem, and it's easy to see why. I mean, the damn thing is near 17,000 lines long, most of it being composed of if-else statements. Now, for those who don't know anything about coding, an if-else statement is meant to be a conditional statement where you check to see if a certain condition in your code is true or false. For example, let's say I have a script that checks to see if a fruit that I picked out of a basket is an apple or an orange. I would write something along the lines of this. Bonus points if you can guess which language I used. Now, when discussing the problems with the code, people like to say that Yandere Dev should use a switch statement instead of an if-else statement. A switch statement, much like an if-else statement, is a conditional statement that checks to see if conditions are true or false. However, there are some differences between the two. First being the syntax, or how it's written. Using the apples and oranges example from before, here's how that code would be written in a switch statement. And here's a shot of them side by side for comparison. See the differences? Now, of course, their differences don't go just as far as looking differently. They also function differently. As opposed to an if-else, a switch statement reads a conditional beforehand and then reads the part of the code that corresponds to that condition. The big difference between the two is that an if-else statement would, if needed to, go through every condition to see which one was right, while a switch statement would be able to go to the correct action instantly because it read what condition was beforehand. However, that being said, there are some misconceptions that people have surrounding this critique, so let's go over them. This misconception came about because of many people who were talking about the code in the past, and people have begun to believe that if-else statements are just a form of bad code. First of all, there's no such thing as bad code, only code that's either optimal or not optimal for whatever you're trying to make. Using one if-else statement in your code is not going to suddenly tank it. That's not how that works. Having 3 if-else statements as opposed to having 3 switch statements doesn't make that big of a difference. Plus, this critique would only work if switch statements were to make a huge difference in the game's frame rate. And while technically switch statements are faster than if-else statements when run by the compiler, it wouldn't really matter much to the game's frame rate. In fact, there was another YouTuber by the name of DYC3 who actually went through the entire student script file and changed all the if-else statements that he could. First of all, good on you, dude. I would not have the vitality to go through that. But second of all, even though it did technically have a small impact on the game's performance, nothing really much changed. And that's because all you did was change how 17,000 lines of code are being checked each frame. Not that there are 17,000 lines of code being checked each frame. But how exactly would you fix something like this? Well, the answer seems pretty obvious. Just remove some of the conditions being checked. An example of this would be the affection checker. There's a part of the code that will check what affection level a student has for a romantic partner, in which he has an if-else statement to check for each certain value. However, you don't even really need that many if-else statements. In fact, there's a way to do it by using just one. All you have to do is just divide the number by 25, since each one of the affection levels are divisible by 25. And the affection levels themselves are all numbers between 0 and 4, so dividing the number by 25 would make things a lot easier and also simplify the code. Also, when it comes to specific attributes that each NPC has as well, such as hair, eye color, their ID number, and other attributes, all of that can be stored inside of a parent class and then made into different subclasses for each of the students and teachers. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, classes and subclasses are a part of object-oriented programming. I really don't have a lot of time to mention what that is or go fully into detail, but to give you a summary, object-oriented programming allows you to store data inside of classes and objects. And if you do so, you can then create subclasses that can inherit those objects and use them should they need to. Here's an example of that. Let's say I wanted to create a class called Animal. Well, obviously I would need to fill the Animal class with things that an animal has, such as fur, a tail, etc. Since I created a class, I'm now able to then store those attributes inside of an object. Now, let's say I wanted to make a subclass called Lion. Thanks to OOP, I don't actually have to initialize or create any new variables. I simply just have to copy and paste the object into the subclass, albeit having to change a couple of things in order to make it work. Just to make sure that the code works, I'm going to add in a function here to print things to the console. Basically, what the code does is check to see if the bool variables I declared earlier are either true or false. And now in my main function, I can simply assign the attributes with their true and false values by calling in the subclass. And boom, that's how object-oriented programming works. It's very helpful when making games as it allows developers to reuse a lot of code without having it impact performance too much. So what Alex should have done is declare a bunch of variables and maybe even make a few functions inside of a huge NPC main class and then store those attributes inside of an object. That way he could then pick and choose what he would want to have activated at any given time and what he wouldn't want to be run. However, there are going to be some segments of the code that do make sense to be checked a bunch, such as checking for any sort of suspicious activity and or bodies that may be lying on the floor. And yes, I know this screenshot is old, trust me, I will get into that. But there are better ways to do something like this. For example, you can have all these if-else statements or even a switch statement if you want to write that placed inside of a while loop. A while loop basically makes it so when a certain condition is true, everything inside of the loop is executed. But they will only be executed when the condition in the while loop is met. If it isn't, the compiler skips over the code inside of the loop. This makes it so the compiler doesn't have to be constantly checking whether or not an NPC sees anything suspicious. For my final critique until we get into Yandere Dev's response to people's complaints about the code, I wanted to talk a bit about how the code is structured as well. So the main student behavior file obviously doesn't need to have so much code in that one script file. What you should do instead of having one script file, you should instead have a script folder. If there's anything that I've learned from programming a game, it's that you should never try to put a lot of things into a single file. Stuff like students checking what time it is, student ID checks, noticing certain objects, bodies, or blood in the world, all of that could be put into separate files. Then you can have one main script file that imports all the other files and then can call on individual script files whenever one of them is needed. It makes things a lot more readable and easier to diagnose any problems that come up. Plus, you should always try to write different scripts for different students. I know it may seem tedious to write different scripts for each student separately, especially if there's going to be nearly 90 students in the game, but in the long run, it helps because NPCs aren't constantly checking things that they don't need to, which has led to performance problems. You can literally see this happen when every student in the game is killed. Okay, so for this next segment of the video, I was re-downloading Yandere Simulator to kind of prove my point about the game's frame rate, but as I was downloading the game, my fucking computer's antivirus was flagged. Okay. Regain composure. Let's get back into the video. As you can see here, when I'm near the students in my game, my FPS was around 30 to 35, with it occasionally going into 40. But once I killed every NPC in the game, my FPS suddenly shot up to being around 80 to 90. And it was while writing this script that I realized something else. If you watched any of Yandere Dev's videos, there are some times where he brings up just how hard it is to make changes to his code, and even minor code changes nowadays can take upwards of 20 minutes. But the thing is that I don't think it was because coding for his game is harder than other games, or that coding in and of itself is hard. I think it's because he had to constantly make changes to this gigantic file. Just really goes to show how inefficient the code is. Part 2. Lies and Manipulation. So on Yandere Simulator's main page, there's a section where he talks about the coding of the game and some of the quote-unquote misinformation that has been spread about it. Disregarding the fact that this page about your code and other pages talking about less than savory things is probably not going to look good to any Kickstarter, there's a lot of information that he gets wrong here. So let's go through this one by one. At the beginning of Yandere Simulator's development, my goal was to quickly create a rough proof of concept that could be used for pitching the game to Kickstarter. I only wanted to create a simple prototype that would allow me to demonstrate the planned features and mechanics that the final game was meant to have, aka a demo, but okay. During that period of time, I was not concerned with writing efficient or optimized code because I was not planning for any of that code to be in the final version of the game. That code was only written so I could showcase gameplay in YouTube videos and the Kickstarter pitch. However, as I added more features to the proof of concept, it gradually became apparent that I was basically creating a feature-complete slice of the complete game. Again, a demo. Just say the word demo. Instead of following the original plan, I decided to use a proof of concept as the base for the actual game. With this in mind, I began to write cleaner code and also optimize a lot of the less efficient code that has been written in the game's earliest stages. However, people used third-party tools to crack open the game, look inside the earliest code, shared screenshots of it, and accused me of being a bad programmer. For example, this image depicts an inefficient use of if-else statements in Yandere Simulator's code. However, those if-else statements were replaced with switch statements several years ago. It is dishonest and misleading to portray me as a bad programmer using screenshots of code that do not even exist in the game anymore, or code that was already rewritten and optimized a long time ago. So this image has basically been memed until death, with obviously many people pointing out the problems with it. However, he states that he changed the code a long time ago, and it no longer is in the actual scripts. Unfortunately, I can't find the original script file anymore because I don't know what file this piece of code was in, nor do I really feel like scrolling through each file that I find online to see if I can find the original script. However, considering his dishonesty when it comes to many other things, I wouldn't be surprised if he lied about this too. Not only that, but from the decompiles of the game that I could find, pretty much every file has an if-else statement in it. Now, while I said previously that switch statements wouldn't do much, the fact that he still lied about using switch statements here leads me to believe that the code pretty much hasn't changed, and that this image probably still holds up. Not only that, but while I haven't written switch statements in Unity before, I have written it for other projects that have to pertain to my coding classes, and I'm pretty sure that's not how you write a switch statement. In fact, I'm pretty sure the case statements up here don't actually do anything in the code, and are just kind of there for no reason. If you want to scrub through the code that I'm currently looking at, the two repositories that I used will be down in the description. One of them claims to be a direct decompile of the game, and the other is more of an approximation using the most recent public build. In both cases that I've seen, he's still basically using the same code. There are people who insist that Yandere Simulator has a low frame rate because of if-else statements. However, if-else statements don't actually have a significant impact on the game's frame rate. Computers are extremely fast at iterating through lists. It is true that a computer can iterate through a list of switch statements faster than if-else statements, but the difference would be less than a millisecond. It's not enough to affect the game's frame rate. Anyone can test this by making two scripts that perform an identical operation, using if-else statements in one script and switch statements in the other script. Tell a computer to log how much time it takes to execute each script, and you'll see that the difference between an if-else and a switch statement is so minor that it's completely irrelevant. Even with that said, there is yet another reason why these accusations are invalid. Although there are still a few scripts in the game where I employ a long chain of if-else statements, most of those scripts only run for one frame. A script that only runs for one frame and then never runs again cannot possibly affect a game's frame rate. And even with that said, there is still yet another reason why it's pointless to criticize the use of if-else statements. Even if the if-else statements were a big problem, it doesn't take much to edit a script to convert if-else statements into switch statements. Converting this into this only takes a few seconds. Any problem that can be fixed in less than a minute is not a significant problem. Okay, so let's tackle this one by one, shall we? First of all, he talks about if-else statements versus switch statements, to which just go back to the first part of my video. Secondly, he says that the differences between an if-else statement and a switch are less than a millisecond. And while technically true, that only happens in small instances, not with entire scripts upon scripts like how he structured the game's code. Not only that, but he says he only uses if-else statements in the code that runs in only one frame of the game, something that is just not true, as I and many others have pointed out, using his code that he A, showed in his videos, and B, through decompilations of the game. Not only that, but he says if it was a big problem to not use switch cases, changing the code wouldn't take that long. But if that's the case, why haven't you? Most of the scripts that I went through have 0 switch cases in them, or anything else that I've suggested throughout this video. If it's so easy for you to fix, and it would take absolutely no time at all for you to fix, why haven't you? Yandere Simulator is made using the Unity game engine. Unity has a tool called the Profiler, which shows us what the CPU is spending most of its time on. The Profiler shows us that the CPU spends 48% of its time on rendering, and only 12% of its time executing the update functions of the scripts. This discredits the idea that bad code is the culprit of any frame rate issues found in Yandere Simulator. Improving Yandere Simulator's frame rate will involve making optimizations to rendering, and not code. The most heavy script used in the game, the student script file, only takes up 2% of the CPU's time, and that's only because there are 88 of them running simultaneously. That's right, the one script that uses the most else-if statements only needs to run 88 times to make even 2% of a difference. It may be worth mentioning that Yandere Simulator has a bad frame rate became a meme many years ago when Yandere Simulator actually did suffer from performance issues. However, the game has been through many optimizations and frame rate improvements since then, making the meme less and less accurate with the passage of time. In 2016, it would have been true to say that even a powerful computer could not run Yandere Simulator at an acceptable frame rate. However, that same computer should have no problem running a 2023 build of Yandere Simulator. The bottom line is that most people who have attempted to critique my code have made a large number of completely incorrect and invalid statements to their audiences, leading countless people to develop an inaccurate perception of Yandere Simulator's code and my own programming ability. So again, let's go through this one by one. First of all, rendering. Now, rendering has always had a big impact on frame rate, and that isn't going to go away, especially as games get bigger and more realistic. But what Yandere Dev fails to realize is that the code is going to impact your rendering if said code is poorly optimized. This is because, since rendering and coding are calculated through the CPU, if your CPU is taking up a lot of time on your scripts, it's not going to be able to work on other things, such as, rendering. Not only that, but if you have multiple objects that you need to render together, that can take up a huge chunk of time as well. Also, you'll need to write code for rendering too. I mean, it's not like you can just drag and drop models into Unity and suddenly Unity knows how everything is rendered, when to render certain things, and what animations to render at specific times and places. You need to write code for that. And since your rendering code is as poorly optimized as your behavior code, it's going to take up much more time. Also, stuff like pathfinding and animations are a part of rendering too, and if you didn't know, pathfinding and animations are dependent on code. Sure, animations and stuff can be made inside Blender and don't need code there, but when you put it into a game, you now need to tell the computer when to play the certain animations, and big shock, you need to do that with coding. So the reason why rendering is taking up so much time and is affecting frame rate is not because of some unknown issue that has yet to be solved, it's due to your own coding getting in the way of the CPU's runtime. The next big thing that is impacting the CPU as shown in these screenshots is the script files. Who would have thought that? The next thing that's having an impact is physics, and physics is literally just code. So much for saying that your coding isn't bad when in fact the physics in your game is a problem. So the things having the most impact on your game's frame rate have direct ties to how your code is structured, including animations, which is just below physics. So with all that in mind, it's no wonder why people are criticizing your code, because your code is what's holding the game back. Now to Yandere Dev's credit, he states that the game has a better frame rate now, and yeah, that is true, as demonstrated by the footage that I showed earlier. I think it's mainly contributed to the fact that he switched coding languages. He used to develop the game in JavaScript, but has now switched over to using C#, which is a much better programming language for developing games. However, that took several years to do so, and even still, even after I upgraded my computer, the game still ran at a lower frame rate than most AAA games that I play on my PC. If he wants the game to succeed, then he's going to have to account for the fact that not everyone is going to have $2,000 or more lying around for a good gaming PC. Most people will probably be trying to run the game on PCs or laptops that don't have the latest specs. In that case, it'll be good to optimize the game so that way they won't have those issues when running into this sort of thing. Part 3. Conclusion. To close this whole thing off, I wanted to go over two things. One, I want to reiterate again that I am by no means an expert on coding. After all, I'm still learning, but I feel like I know enough to the point where my critiques are still valid. However, if there are other people who watch this video who want to give their own coding critiques, I invite you to leave a comment down below. 2, I know that Yandere Simulator is, by all accounts, dead at this point. With the stuff that's come out about Yandere Dev and several of the game's key staff, that being stuff like asset creators and voice actors, leaving because of the controversy surrounding Yandere Dev, it's very unlikely that the game will ever finish. But the reason why I made this video is a sort of retrospective / post-mortem, looking back at the game and the game's coding to see what can be learned from it. This is hopefully to educate people who want to make their own games in the future about what not to do when making games. However, that said, that's going to be it for me for now. Thank you so much for watching, and if you made it to the end, don't forget to leave a comment on whether or not you liked the video and you want to see more in the future, as I like talking about this kind of stuff. If you enjoyed it, make sure to also leave a like and subscribe. But with that said, I'll see you next time, and until then, stay safe and take care.